I'm joined today by Craig Gent, who many of you already know as an author of several articles on my website. And he's also written pieces for 007 GB Clubs magazine and website. So, really, really happy to finally have Craig on a podcast after how long is it we've known each other, Craig?
Oh my gosh. And since shortly after the release of No Time to Die.
Oh, okay. It was then, was it? Okay. Time's still a bit timey-wimey in my
Yeah,
brain.
yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Well, especially when you're, trying to follow the sort of Bond calendar as well. I feel like I used to be able to tell what year it was by like film release dates, and now since
Who
since
knows?
sort of Skyfall, just who knows anymore, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. We're in this no man's land of no bonds, so you know, we can be forgiven for not knowing what date it is. And in fact, we're recording this early in 2025 as well. So, I'm bound to make that
Wow, I hadn't
mistake a
even thought
few
about that.
times. Yeah.
Yeah.
So how did, in fact, my memory's so bad, Craig. How did we actually get to know each other?
Uh, well, I think I followed you on Twitter for a while. We can get into this, but through like the lockdowns and stuff,
Hmm.
I was like following the Bond news like quite intently. And then I sort of found my way into the kind of, I guess like that kind of like ecology of like, podcasts and websites and
Hmm.
YouTube channels and things like that. So I remember I first of all started listening to Lisa Funnell's License to Critique
Mm.
podcast. And then I listened to James Bond and Friends podcast,
Hmm.
and then Calvin Dyson's YouTube channel. And it just kind of, like it was like a,
Yeah.
gateway drug kind of thing. And then um and then yeah, I sort of ended up on like Bond Twitter for a while. I've never been a habitual Twitterer, but like I was on there for a bit. And yeah, I suppose I followed you for a while. And then after No Time to Die like finally came out, and then of course there was this sort of like massive sort of divisive reaction within like the community. I'd kind of written this piece just on spec really, and then I sort of needed a home for it, and I think I came to you,
Hmm.
um, and we kind of it went from there. And then of course we hadn't met in person until there was that Birmingham event at the Belfry,
Oh yeah, about
which was the
18
double O
months ago
Seven
now. Yeah.
GB
Mm.
event around 18 months ago. Yeah,
Mm.
so that's when we met in person. Yeah.
And the reason we're chatting today as part of the On Our Minds Only series, well, actually, if you've read Craig's pieces, which are absolutely brilliant pieces, then you'll know that Craig has an awful lot to say about aspects of mental health. And in fact, we were before we started recording, we were like, we could take it in this direction, we could take it in this direction. We actually haven't decided what direction to take this in. So I always love these episodes because I really don't know what's quite going to happen next. But we started talking about being a bit of an outsider and feeling like an outsider. I've always said that Bond works for me as a character, partly because although we think he fits in with the social milieu in which he moves, he's actually essentially an outsider for them from the rest of society. But I think as well, there was a time 5 years ago, perhaps before I started doing what I was doing as licensed to queer, where I felt like an outsider in the Bond community as well. And then I started doing what I do, and then found actually a very welcoming community. And I think you've sort of undergone a kind of similar trajectory. Is that right, Craig?
Yeah, I think so. Like, I got into Bond when I don't know how old. It'd be sometime in the 90s when I've been under the age of 10. Um, and like one of the first things I ever remember of Bond was like James Bond Jr. and seeing the
Mm.
figurines in shops and kind of wanting that. And finding my way kind of into the films. And there was a period of time where I think one Christmas, like all of my family and extended family had kind of all agreed to get like one VHS each so that I could have like, the whole kind of collection up to and including uh Tomorrow Never Dies. That would have been. And then I carried them around in like a record bag everywhere I went. So if I went to like, my nan's house, I'd take my record bag that perfectly fit in, these sort of
Mm,
like 18 or so, VHSs. And I kind of like, carry them sort of everywhere with me. And then I think at some point, maybe in my sort of teenage years, I just sort of went off it. Um,
mm,
I didn't sort of go off it in that like I stopped like liking the films or anything like that. I just sort of didn't really feel like it fit with like where I was at
yeah.
in my life, and I sort of struggled to relate to it. I think a big thing for me was that I got quite like politically motivated around the time of like the Iraq War and stuff. Like that was very sort of eye-opening for
Hmm.
me and some friends at school and stuff while we were teenagers. And then this kind of idea of Bond as this kind of like almost patriotic figure,
Hmm.
just never sat well with me. Um, and I think that, and I think probably part of it is also just a sort of when you're a teenage or, as a young person, you struggle with the idea that you can be many things, and you feel like you kind of have to be like one thing in a sort of like a
Mm.
in a sort of pure way. So like, when I was in like a punk band, we would sort of cover songs from other punk bands. We would never kind of want to stray like too far away. And then when I was in a blues
Mm.
band, it would be like that, and we'd never kind of want to get too far out of the box. And so you sort of struggle with contradiction in this way. And then I think that, when I sort of started getting into kind of the diversity of like sort of Bond fan created media that there is. As I say, like starting with, I mean, people don't know like Lisa Funnell's work, like it's kind of all about like feminism and Bond,
Hmm.
but she's a massive Bond fan and she's got
Hmm.
like her kind of like critique, but like that doesn't stop her enjoying it and loving it. Um, and then, hearing podcasts where there's like a range of voices with a range of views on different things. Um, I think it was like a good thing to come across that made me think, oh, okay, there's a whole sort of like plurality here. And actually, often some of the things that we hear about the character of Bond or the world of Bond out in the world don't actually map on to what people think about it, who really love it, or even really map onto like the essence of what it is when we look a bit deeper. And of course, that's what License to Queer is all about. So it's been, massive for me, really, to come across the website and be involved and so on. So now, I mean, I very much feel kind of like part of like the Bond community, and there are like, there are always bits of it that different people gravitate to for all sorts of different reasons, and like I do think there's a sort of like, most people have a sort of like a live and let live attitude, if you excuse the not quite pun, um, and that's like very refreshing and actually not always mirrored like everywhere else in life, like. I think that's like quite a nice thing. It feels like a bit of a, yeah, there's a bit of a community.
What you said there, what you shared about feeling almost like Bond wasn't for you in a period of your life when you were starting to become more politically engaged and so forth, it's actually not that uncommon. And having said that, it's something that's not really been that written about. I've done a little bit about it, but I've keep meaning to write more about it myself. But there was about 2 or 3 years in my life where I just didn't feel like Bond was for me. And I sometimes like to blame Die Another Day for this, a film which I've, of course, come to love now. But 2002 to 2005 was about the period where I just thought Bond wasn't for me. And I do credit Casino Royale with sort of hooking me back into James Bond and feeling like I did have a place in the fandom. But I do hear it from a few other queer contributors to the website as well. Even if they've not written about it, they've shared with me that they went through a period of time where they thought, am I really the sort of person who should be liking James Bond? And of course, there's that word should, which I'm always really, really hyper conscious about.
Mm.
Telling yourself that you should like certain things and you shouldn't like other things. But, you still get the comments every so often. I don't get them very much anymore, but a few years ago, it was just like, you're a gay guy. What do you like about James Bond?
Yeah.
And I've obviously my solution to that was to create a whole website called License to Queer, and it's like, well, we're here, we're queer. James Bond fans exist who are queer too. So that was sort of my way of kind of setting out my stall. And it's been great that other people have kind of found that empowering in that sense as well.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think that I mean, I mentioned the sort of like the becoming like politically active thing, but like
Mm,
it was the everything, it was
mm,
the fact that I was thinking about the world really for, in a big way for the first time. Like my route into kind of like learning about politics was that my mom was like doing an access course and she was doing like women's studies and she was kind of, as single parent, she was a single parent, so she would sort of bring this stuff home and we would like talk about it. And so like my kind of like political consciousness kind of came about in a way through sort of like, what was then like second wave like feminist theory and stuff that
mm,
she was like bringing back on like videotapes and stuff from
mm,
college. Um, and it just didn't seem to sort of fit in. I mean, I'm still not a sexist. I don't think that like Bond fans are like sexist, but like there are some people who see the character as inherently sexist and that kind of thing. And so that
mm,
I think that's probably why I gravitated towards like that sort of like interrogation of the Bond world in the first place. Um, but also like I was becoming, sexually active for the first time, like as a bisexual, and thinking like Bond just doesn't sort of sit anywhere in this, and
mm,
both feeling like I shouldn't be doing, shouldn't be into this, or that it's not for me. It's not made for with people like me
mm,
in mind or whatever. And I don't even know what I mean by that because as much as anyone, I hate the kind of like, you watch some films and you can see the cogs moving, you can see what they're doing and like who they're trying to play to, and it's just so cringe and awful, like it really turns me off. So like I wouldn't want like Bond to sort of like make like big overtures, to me. But like the fact that like, and this is what I think License to Queer does so well, like the fact that really when you look, it's all there. It's already there. It's always been there. It's been there since the 60s, undeniably, in my opinion. It's been there since the books, I'm listening to From Russia with Love
mm,
again, and it's read by I think it's read by Toby Stevens, who
mm,
is a wonderful, wonderful reader. Um, and like the first chapter is like Fleming just poring over this man's body, and like it's just, he is absolutely fixated on like the male form, in a way that is completely hot. And like
And
it's just,
it's
it's
funny you
sort of
say that fixating on the male form because I'm rereading From Russia with Love at the moment. Weirdly enough, we didn't,
right, interesting.
and that opening chapter, I'd missed this all the times I've read it before because I've spotted it in several of the other books, especially Doctor No. But the female masseuse is described. I'm trying to remember which body part it is, but she's described as having quite a masculine part of her body. Fleming does this all
Yeah,
the time. He
yeah,
gives women masculine physical qualities and men
yeah.
feminine qualities. More frequently, I think women masculine qualities, like
Mm,
Honey Rider's boy's bottom, for instance,
yeah.
is probably the most famous example, even the one that made Noel Coward sit up and go, Ian, I think you might have gone a bit too far here.
Yeah.
But From Russia with Love has that quality as well, and she gets the opening line of From Russia with Love is about a naked man.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right, Craig. It doesn't get
Who
any
even
more
I mean, he
like
remains naked even while he gets up to answer the phone. Like
yeah.
he doesn't. There's no modesty. There's something almost kind of yeah, sort of ancient about it.
Mm,
Um, so yeah, I don't know. I had that kind of experience, and then this kind of like big sort of like returning to Bond, and obviously the anticipation of the film and stuff helped.
mhm,
Finding that there was already this kind of like wealth of podcasts and videos and stuff that I could go and watch that would kind of give me like my fix. And then by the time it was like, No Time to Die was going to come out, I was like so ready for it. And I think the funny thing is like that is a film that I want to rewatch so infrequently. It hasn't worked its way into my kind of like my roster yet. Not really.
Mm.
Like everyone has the experience of like, just like, oh, it's a certain day of the week, maybe it's a Sunday afternoon, the weather looks a certain way. It kind of, it tunes you into like a particular film that you want to sit down and watch.
Mm.
I haven't worked out when my like time and space to watch No Time to Die is yet, which is interesting because I was so effusive about the film when
Mm.
I
Mm.
saw it. I had such a huge reaction, really big reaction to it emotionally. Um, and like, now, I mean, if I look at it like, objectively as a film without all the baggage, like I can see, all the problems that everyone else raises, time and again. But yeah, I don't know. It really felt like it sort of like brought up a lot, and it felt like a sort of like a coming home for me,
Mm.
to the franchise, to a community that I hadn't known existed, and I suppose to like a sort of like there was a certain sort of like acceptance there. I mean, like tacitly, like no one was kind of like in the community sort of going, welcome, welcome, like, but
Mm.
there was a feeling like I had somewhere I could sort of like fit in. And I suppose this goes back to like the thing that we were saying that maybe this episode may or may not be about, which is that feeling like you don't fit in or feeling like an
Mhm.
outsider or like you're always on the outside of things, which like I want to be clear is like not an imposter syndrome thing.
No.
Like I've always felt that I'm very capable. In fact, people have always said I'm very capable, very responsible, and very reliable, all of these things. And if anything, they make it worse, this feeling that I'm kind of like an outsider. Like, um, and so it's something that I kind of always had. And at certain points in my life, different kind of cultural artifacts maybe would like reinforce this sense in me, the way I'd want to dress at school or the fashions that I was interested in. But like at a certain point in time, it was also like the fact that I was like majorly into Bond. And that wasn't really like a thing that like lots of young people
Hmm.
were into. Not where I lived anyway.
Yeah.
I had like one classmate who was kind of like tangentially interested in Bond through like the video games and like through of all things, Never Say Never Again uh VHS. He had Never Say Never Again and Octopussy on VHS, bless him, which I just, I think is showing my hand here, but is not the strongest set of VHSs that you could wish to hold in your collection. Um, so yeah, I don't know.
I I think it's really interesting because you're obviously a bit younger than me, but the Bond was probably a bit more cool when I was at school, mostly because of GoldenEye, the game, and but again, it was a niche interest, and I think as a Bond fan, I was a bit of an outsider at school. And I think there is something about Bond fans in general. I think we are drawn to the outsider quality of the character. I think some people
Mm,
think Bond he's not an outsider because he's kind of like I suppose, in a sense, the heteronormative ideal on the surface. But as you've said, it's all there, and I point out at length on the website, and you've contributed to, it isn't really that. That's what it looks like on the surface. But
mm,
Bond
mm,
Bond really doesn't fit in many ways. I mean, it's most explicitly articulated by Fleming in Moonraker, where Bond feels like he just doesn't fit in with M's club. He doesn't fit in England. I've written some bits about this. I don't think it is imposter syndrome. I have written about imposter syndrome before, but for me, imposter syndrome is when you hit the nail on the head. It's when you almost don't feel capable of doing the job. And I believe imposter syndrome was originally coined in the late 1970s. And it did come from feminist theory, the idea that actually predominantly women felt imposter syndrome because they felt like they had to really prove themselves in the workplace and do a job much more
interesting.
effectively than a man.
Yeah.
So it's not something that we historically, 50 years ago when that term originated, associated with men. So I'm not sure Bond ever has imposter syndrome. He feels like he is extremely capable, but that doesn't mean he always fits in with the societies that he moves through.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that, I mean, this is one of the things where maybe I have sort of like a disconnect with like the way Bond is perceived, not by Bond fans, but by like the world, you know?
Mm.
Um, in the sense that like it's kind of, you're most likely to sort of like read that he's a kind of like, flag waving, like upper class,
Hmm.
like chauvinist or whatever. Probably, somewhat approvingly in like the supplement to like the Mail on Sunday or something like that, which is like I used to devour that stuff like as a kid. I've still got in my Bond collection like loads of like Sunday supplements and stuff that were kind of always about Bond and so on. But like I think that it's all there in the page, like the whole the shaken not stirred sort of faux pas, and yeah, like him not like fitting into blades and things like that, and even the fact that he kind of he comes into the office to like come visit uh, MI6, and then he's like back out again. That's where he wants to be. And, certainly in the films up to a certain age, the only time you ever see Bond in the office, like he's going there to collect his things to resign in on the Majesty's Secret Service. And even in the sort of later Daniel Craig years when we've got the whole sort of Scooby Gang, as they're now affectionately known, like, there's like a million of them back in the office, telling him what to do with his defibrillator, and he's there out in the field, sort of, more or less by himself. And so this sense of him kind of like, I mean, I guess we get the idea that he's sort of like too, larger than life to kind of fit into the world. But like, is he really? Because actually, he's kind of quite sort of introverted, and quite sort of um he's an observer, isn't he? He sort of, he observes and he perceives and he judges. And I don't think that he is. I mean, obviously, yeah, maybe in the sort of Roger Moore years, but he's not usually, walking into the room and wanting to attract all the attention to himself, per se. He doesn't mind a bit of it, of course.
I had a chat with a clinical psychologist a couple of years ago on this podcast, and he pointed out that all of James Bond's relationships are conditional. So we talk about the Scooby Gang, but all of his relationships, they're workplace relationships. It's like there's conditions attached to that. It's like he Bond's only acquaintances are people he knows through work. He doesn't really have
Mhm.
friends. In fact, there's a line which I reread this morning, funnily enough, in From Russia with Love, about Bond not really having acquaintances, but only a very small number of people he would call truly close friends. Bond's actually quite alone, and I think that's something that I've always connected with. You can be surrounded by people, but you can still feel really, really alone. And I think that's an aspect of the character that doesn't get enough attention as well.
Yeah, I mean, well, just very briefly on the sort of the work relationships thing. I won't be able to recall any of the contents right now, but there's an academic article, if people are that way inclined, by an organizational theorist called Martin Parker, who's written some amazing books. I mean, he writes about all sorts of organizations, but he's mostly interested in sort of, the work organization of things that are quite far out, like the mafia or like, pirates, things like that. And sort of like looking at these as like work organizations. And he's got a piece about Bond, where he kind of, really gets into it. So I recommend, seeking it out. He's a good writer as well. It's not like a fusty academic type. Um, so yeah, worth checking out. But I think that's exactly it. Like he's quite a lonely sort of figure. And
Mm,
I think like, to kind of do the sort of handbrake turn into one's childhood, which is, in the on our minds only tradition, is that like I think I'm probably only really as an adult like realizing that I had quite a lonely childhood.
mm,
Because I didn't think I did. Because I always felt like, oh, I've got lots of friends. I was never like a loner in that sense. Like I always, my school reports would say that I was well liked and things like that. I wasn't like the odd one out in the sense of being like odd. I say that in a value neutral way. You know, some people are quite
Mm,
odd. A lot of
mm,
my friends are quite odd. That's what I like about them. But like I didn't seem sort of odd as a child. Um, I maybe seemed more grown up in some ways, but maybe more distracted in other
mm,
ways, you know. Um, and yeah, I think I sort of now realize that I had quite a sort of like a
mm.
lonely childhood, really. Which is, I suppose, a result of the fact that I had two big sort of schisms in my childhood. One was that um, some people might struggle to place my accent because basically I grew up in Barnsley in South Yorkshire, but I don't have, unless I'm speaking in dialect, which is a different language with people from Barnsley, I don't have a strong accent because I was originally born in the South.
Mm.
I was originally born in the South, and then when I was 8 years old, I was sort of just told really that we were going to be moving to South Yorkshire. And so I got sort of taken out of that place with a very strong Southern accent into not
Mm.
just Barnsley, which is famous, if people don't know, famous for its sort of broad dialect, which really rivals the deepest, darkest parts of Black Country. And for its impenetrability. And but not only that, but like a village that within Barnsley which is the next mining town, is known for being especially broad. And so I was sort of put into the playground suddenly with people that I literally did not understand, and they struggled to understand me. And it was like there was an actual language barrier that I had to
Mm.
kind of overcome. Um, and especially when you're that kind of age, you want to just get to school and fit in quite quickly. And suddenly it's like there is no way about it. You are not going to fit in here. Like you are not from here. I remember going to there was a fish and chip shop on the end of our street, and my mum sending me in there to like go and get some fish and chips, and being terrified of like just saying the order once I got to the front of the queue, because I'd be in a room full of like Barnsley men speaking in ex-miners speaking in like proper townspeak, as they call it, like Barnsley dialect. Um, and yeah, being sort of like terrified of it. So there's that. So, but and then once I sort of found my feet, um, I mean, I don't really know how to say it other than that my mom, me, and my sister, we left our home to go move into women and children's domestic violence refuge, and suddenly I'd kind of made these friends and stuff, and I had to leave the school, and I couldn't tell them where I'd gone. I couldn't tell them where I lived now and that kind of stuff. Um, and I mean, after we were been in the refuge, we got rehoused and that kind of stuff. But obviously, when you're in the refuge, you can't reveal the location or anything like that. And I got sent to a new school, and we got a new house. And then I could kind of reach out and speak to some old friends. I guess my mum and their mum like chat to each other, and they'd come over and stuff like that, and try and reestablish the friendship a little bit. But yeah, I kind of got like I just got removed from that situation and put into a very different situation, and then put into like a different school again. And I think my narrative about it for a long time was like, oh well, it makes me good at making friends. It makes me really good at making friends because I moved from one place to a different part of the country, and then I moved schools, and then it made me like very capable, made me like very. I don't get nervous walking into a group of people and stuff like that. I mean, I do a
Mm.
bit now, but like for many, many years, I didn't. If I'd tell myself I don't get nervous, that would just be like a thing I believed about myself. I mean, patently untrue, but I sort of really strongly believed it about myself that I didn't get nervous and took some sort of pride in it. Um, and on top of that, I suppose, the thing was is that, somewhat unhelpfully, and I mean, this is probably coming from a few of the articles I wrote for License to Queer, but like, I had a relative say to me, oh, you need to be big and brave for your mom and your sister.
Mm.
You need to You're the man of the house now. I was 9. It was
Mm.
9. You're the man of the house now. Um, and I still see it as like that's when my childhood ended. It ended when I was 9. Um, I took I could take 2 toys with me on the night that we left, and one of them was an action man that was on a bike. One of them was a soft toy. Um, and the action man I never played with again. I just never played with him again. After that night, um, I didn't sort of see the point. And the bear I did keep, and is still in good nick and stuff. And people always say, I've got quite a dark sense of humor. People say, "Oh, your bear's really soft," and I'm like, "Oh yeah, yeah, I've had him since I was really little." And they're like, "Oh, I can't believe he's in such good condition." I said he's been well conditioned by the tears of my childhood, and of course, it's horrifying for people to hear, but it's probably true. He's a good bear.
Wow. So I knew a bit of that, Craig, from what you'd previously written for my website. But I've sort of joined a few more dots in my head now. Particularly if people listening to this haven't read your brilliant article which you wrote off the back of the Barbie movie and about action men and what those meant to you.
Mm.
Definitely read that piece. Um, why do you think you didn't play with the action man again?
I don't know. I don't know. I think that do you know what? Like, it sounds really weird to say. I never thought about it until this very moment. But like, so he was an action man, like that kind of was on like a mountain bike or something.
Mm,
So a bit of a fancy one in a way. He wasn't just like your regular doll. He was sort of an action man on a mountain bike, and like so as he pedaled, his like knees went round. It seemed such a strange thought, and I can't tell you why I had it at the time, but my feeling, even though I didn't have the word at the time, was that it felt decadent.
mm.
It felt like weirdly decadent
Yeah.
in this kind of like context that there's this kind of like toy that seems a bit like flashy, you know?
Mm,
Because out of the lineup of action men, I guess it would have been like a special one, which is probably why I picked it.
mm,
But I don't really remember there being much kind of play, you know. Um, when we got to the refuges have people who don't know, they are in a undisclosed location. They're not really like away from the world. They're just probably on a high street or something like that. This one, I think, I don't know what it had been previously. It later got made into a police station for a little while. And then I think got made into like a funeral director for a little while. And now it's been moved somewhere else, completely. Um, Sort of big building outside a bus stop on a high street. And it had a number of families in it, and you all share a room. So there was a kind of you know, sort of semicircle of beds, single beds inside the room, one for me, one for mum, one for my sister. Um, and there's like a kid's room, and sometimes they have like a child worker kind of come in. But I was the oldest child by like quite some distance. And so I didn't have kind of any cause to sort of play with other children. And then I suppose by the time I got to my new school, I would have been in year 5. So um, I was what, 10, 9, 10. Um, and I suppose, then you're kind of getting to that age where like playing itself, if you're in certain crowds in school, like playing
mm,
itself isn't kind of like the done thing. You kind of like amble about and argue and, you know, trade banned Pokemon cards and things like that. And so kind of like, yeah, I guess, I think in some corners of the playground, play itself, you're obviously educated, this like it sort of gets extinguished a little bit and
yeah,
something a bit more
totally.
serious sort of takes over. Um, and I remember thinking that I couldn't wait to get to like to big school, couldn't couldn't wait. And then even once I was at sort of secondary school, I was like hanging out with like the older kids always, I was always the youngest of the friendship group, which probably added a little bit to this sort of feeling that I was a little bit kind of, on the periphery sort of thing. But I'd be kind of, yeah, I'd always be sort of, I was often involved with sort of, my sort of friendship groups and stuff, such as they were always sort of like musically orientated. And
Mm.
so I'd sort of be hanging out with kind of like the music crowd of sort of, freaks and weirdos, who were like into, making music and stuff. But even then, I mean, I wasn't like into like the same music as other people. Like I was into like soul music, and stuff like that, and always seemed like a bit of an old head on young shoulders to use that kind of cliche, But I think I think weirdly for a long time I took a certain sort of like pride in it all, like I was just kind of like very resilient, very independent. Like all of these things were like good things to
Hmm.
me. Like the idea of being like independent. Whereas like, being dependent on other people to some extent, like is the thing that makes us human and makes friendships and stuff. And I think that unfortunately, like nowadays, even a lot of the kind of like mental health culture, um, really plays into this like these like individualizing ideas, you know, about sort of taking ownership of yourself and taking responsibility for yourself, or increasing like being resilient and things like that. Um, and a lot of our kind of response to mental health is to look inwards and see about what the individual can do, and can the individual reframe things and all this kind of stuff. A really good friend of mine who was a fantastic cultural writer, Mark Fisher, um, died a few years back, by suicide. And he wrote so eloquently about the privatization of stress,
Mm.
and how, stress and a lot of, mental anguish is really a social pathology, but it's sort of forbidden to talk about it as such. It's um, it's something that we have to deal with in private. Or if we don't deal with it in private, because we can be all sort of like talk about mental health in this kind of sort of like liberal way now. Like when it comes to it, we have to deal with it ourselves. You know, you can choose individually if you're going to take some medication, or if you're going to do that better help course on your app or whatever, or if you're going to do CBT through your workplace, employee program or whatever it is. And fundamentally, we're not getting rid of like the actual sort of pathology itself, or the thing that's like doing this. We're not like
Hmm.
necessarily like challenging the narratives that are like wounding us in these ways.
Mm.
Even if, we see these patterns all across society. The fact that, anxiety is like the sort of like the dominant mental health issue for so many people. But like, since when and for how long? And for me, it seems like, well, it's really since the global financial crisis. Like it's since, we stopped having, being able to count on life getting better, you know, for my generation, like that our lives are going, I think in the 90s we sort of believed that our lives would get better than than they were in the past. And suddenly we realized they wouldn't be. And actually work would be more insecure. We'd have precarious contracts and 0 hours contracts, and we'd have rent forever. We'll live with our mates till we're in our 30s, and, have like these like landlords who can put up the rent 25% every year, like they've just been done in London, and all of this kind of stuff. And it's like, well, it's any wonder that everyone is like really anxious all the time,
Hmm.
like in that sort of situation. I don't know how I got onto that tangent, but
No, it's a good tangent. I mean, just to go back to what you were saying a few minutes ago about, but the idea that keeps going around my head, Craig, is that you had to grow up a lot faster than a lot of other people.
yeah.
As you know, I work in education. We talk about adverse childhood experiences all the time. I've done training on this with staff, and I always say I bet a lot of staff in this room have had adverse childhood experiences themselves, and that's obviously a massive umbrella term for lots of things that can happen during childhood. And we're not trying to play one off against another here or something, but what you experienced as a 9 year old must have led you to have to grow up a lot faster than others. No wonder whatever the social pressures of not being cool to play any longer in the playground. Usually I think that comes a little bit later for a lot of children. But the pressure that you've been put under to be the man of the household and all that sort of thing. You must have had to grow up really quickly, and it keeps making me think of. And again, I never want to trivialize by making a facile James Bond comparison during one of these podcasts, but I can't help relate everything back to James Bond. And James Bond, of course, experiences, the loss of his parents, which is analogous to Fleming losing his own father when he was 7 years old. And there's that scene in Skyfall where, where Albert Finney's character says went into the priest hole, and he came out, basically he was no longer a child afterwards.
Mm.
So we know that adverse childhood experiences have that effect. I certainly think in my own case, the whole trauma of knowing I was gay and absolutely hating myself, from about the age of 7 or 8, that sort of that definitely did a number on me in terms of making me feel like I had to grow up because I had to be self-sufficient because I couldn't rely on anybody else.
Yeah.
So I think this is all tied together.
No, I agree with you. And I don't think it's like a, facile comparison at all. Like I think it's so fundamental like to the character.
Mm,
And I think in some ways like that's what sort of like drew me to it because actually like as I mentioned I first became aware of Bond through kind of like James Bond Jr. and all that kind of stuff. And I was
mm,
aware of I never had a N64, but I was aware of the game and stuff like that. I think my uncle had one. I played it there. Um, that was all like before all this happened.
mm,
After it happened, because I remember like which I moved a lot as a kid, so I always remember which house I was in. After it happened, it was in that new house. That's where I got the the James Bond VHSs.
mm,
And the first Bond film I remember being really excited for was all of the Tomorrow Never The World's Not Enough kind of hype. Which I
mm.
mean, what month did that come out in 1999? October?
Um, Tomorrow Never Dies.
It was not enough.
Well, there's not enough. Yeah, it must have been October.
I think it's October or thereabouts because I
Yeah.
think that's when all the commemorative stuff was happening. So I can tell you right now, October 1999 was when we went into the refuge,
Wow.
and so it was right then. And then we were there until just a few days before Christmas that year when they found us new housing. And so the thing that I got into, and I think that Christmas, like what I got was a VHS player, and I had like a tiny little cube television, and so suddenly I could watch videos in my bedroom, and that's when I got into Bond, like in a big way.
Right.
And so like that was my hobby, you know. So like I would go to school, even when I was still at primary school, and I'd come back and I'd sit on my bed on a I don't even know what you call them now, but like I mean it's kind of a sofa bed, but like do you remember these like there'd be like a piece of foam and it's kind of like a little like they fold it over and then there's like a little bit that's like so you can use it as like a little chair.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like the crappiest thing ever. It's like, but you can use it as like a chair and you can flop it out into like probably like a very short, like single bed if someone's staying over, like I had one
Yeah,
of
yeah,
these.
yeah, yeah. Sofa bed,
Yeah.
essentially. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
We
It's
had
like a
one.
little, like, but it's like a purely foam sort of sofa bed. And so I would put
Yeah,
that
yeah.
on top of my like little single bed. And at the end of the bed was the TV with a video player. So I'd watch, at least one, maybe two Bond films every single night
Wow.
when I got in from school. And I mean, I think I wrote about this in my first article where like,
Mm,
it was just like a world of like fantasy that I could kind of
mm,
go into. Bond was my absolute hero. But like, other people from the series and stuff would, sort of, as people do, I'd, be inspired by different attributes of both female and male characters, within the world of Bond and particularly when, and I say this without any judgment because it happens statistically to very many people, but my my mom did end up for a while, getting back into a relationship with the person who was the cause of us going into a refuge. And so at that point in time, I really was sort of like shut in my room, as much as I could be, because that was a good place to be. Um, and being kind of like with the films, like they were kind of like they were therapeutic. I say that my therapy, but like they were my sort of like therapeutic kind of like outlet, engagement, like whatever. Um, which is why, I mean, still, if I'm like, even today, like, not literally today, but like nowadays, if I'm like having like a bad day, or I'm like gearing up for like a bad day or something like that, I do like, I can say it because I'm among friends I know, but like, I do think, do you know what? I'm going to wear like that Bond t-shirt, like under my shirt or something, or I'm going to wear my Bond socks, or whatever. Just like a little bit of something that just like makes me feel like I've got it. Um, well, not even like I've got it, but makes me feel like, so, like, reminds me whatever it is, who I am or how I want to be,
Is it
or
almost like
whatever.
it's probably
It's
an
like a
overused
comfort.
it's probably an overused term nowadays, but particularly when I've been battling anxiety over the years, a lot of people have told me about grounding techniques, which can be physically as well as mentally. I almost feel like Bond is sort of like you're earthing yourself sometimes. Like I wear Bond socks nearly every day to work. And I think whatever the day throws at me, and I love my job. There's a lot of my job. That's the only thing that's the downside to my job. But I love my job. But whatever the day throws at me, I'm wearing James Bond socks and everything will be fine. Even if it's not fine, I'm carrying a little bit of James Bond with me. And I think that's probably something I know we've admitted it, but I don't know if a lot of people would, but I reckon that's what a lot of people do.
I think grounding is exactly, I mean, that is a good word, isn't it? Grounding, yeah. Because it's also like there's something about like, to stretch that metaphor out, which I absolutely love doing. Like, like grounding is also like it's kind of like it's like your turf, it's
Mm,
like your like where you feel comfortable. It's like,
mm,
it's not just like any old ground, is it? It's like, the ground that you kind of choose, or the place where you feel there's like a place aspect to it, right? Where
mm,
it's kind of like, across time and space, like I'm out and about, I'm at work or whatever. But like, I've got this like piece of clothing, or, whatever it is, some bit of paraphernalia. Um, and it kind of connects you
yeah.
to something that does feel like ground. It feels like rooted. It feels like being, as with, being back on the ground after you've been on a choppy boat or something like that. Like it's got that kind of quality to
Mm,
it.
mm,
And yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, I've many Bond socks now, thankfully. But like my favorite ones are um the ones of with Rosa Klebb,
hmm.
um and Bond on them.
I wore those yesterday.
And you know what? I wear those, and sometimes I look down at my ankles and I think, I fucking love that film, and and that's enough. That's enough. I just feel it every time, and it's yeah, it's a real like sort of connecting thing. And then I guess in a way, that makes me feel like I like that it's my thing, and I've
Mm.
come to terms with that, or made my peace with it in a way.
I almost feel like I want someone to ask me about my socks sometimes. I'm like, yeah, it's a lesbian assassin with, pointed shoes trying to kill James Bond at the end of From Russia with Love. Come on. Everyone knows this.
That's so funny. I think I like that it's a bit of a secret, you know. Um, I wouldn't, would never sort of keep it a secret on purpose, but like I like that it's there and I know about it, and probably no one's going to ask me about it.
I do actually work with someone who is also a massive James Bond fan, and we always wear James Bond socks. So we always do a bit of a sock check. But I suppose that's what you get when you meet fellow Bond fans, isn't it? It's that sense of, if we're talking about feeling like an outsider, when you actually meet a fellow James Bond fan, you do get that feeling of belonging, even if it is just a pair of socks.
You know what? That's so interesting because like I do think that like I've often organized my life in like such a way
Mm,
as to not feel like an outsider.
mm,
Like I kind of consciously the decisions I've made, you know, around work and things like that. So like, you know, I studied um I went to university when I was 18 and I dropped out. Didn't feel like I fitted in, funny
hmm
enough.
hmm
And then I went into work. I didn't fit in there and I got sacked. And then long story short, when I was 20, I went back to university. I was like, I'm going to try it again. And it was a real like I just fell in with like kind of like a cohort that really felt like it was like a small university. It was a campus university. You could stand still on that campus, and within 15 minutes, you would see 4 or 5 people to like nod to or say hello to, you know, who just walked past you. So I really felt like I belonged there, you know.
mm,
And then I stayed on in education, I think partly like sort of like chasing that feeling a little bit, really.
mm,
And then a kind of what had been a passion project, like a media project, became my job. And I left it a few months back, but I was there for 11 years.
mm,
And you know, when I was leaving, reflecting on it, I felt that it gave me it really gave me a sense of belonging,
mm,
which is not to say like I felt like I always fitted in. Like even then, I would often feel like on the outside. You know, whether it's because I had a lot of responsibility or I felt like I had to be the most reliable, even if others could have that bit of, you know, leeway or latitude, you know, very human amount of leeway or latitude. But like I had to kind of be on it all the time. I couldn't drop the ball. Or if I dropped the ball, it'd be somehow worse than if anyone else dropped the ball. And you know, those kinds of situations. And so even though like ostensibly I, you know, a sort of like on a road less traveled, you know, doing a job less worked, um, you know, surrounded by people that I get along with and I've sort of chosen as colleagues rather than just finding myself with these people in this kind of bonding way, you know, to go back to that idea, you know, sort of by chance. Um, you know, I still get this kind of feeling of
mm,
feeling like an outsider. Um, and then it's strange, you know, when you can kind of come to, you know, a place where you're going to meet other Bond fans. You know, I the people I find myself in company with are so different from anyone else in my life. You know, I would never encounter so many of those people, like just in the world. Um, I can't think where our paths would cross. You know, they certainly wouldn't cross in work. I don't think they would sort of cross in education or whatever. Or like, you know, the things I do now, you know, I sort of do a lot of like book events and things like that. Um, and yet, you know, you kind of come into a room where it's not only that people are kind of like do this thing or are interested in this thing, but people like have this like deep emotional connection to it
mm,
that like is just like weirdly miraculous, you know, like no one could have like planned it or whatever. You know, like so people spend so much time and energy thinking about like what they want Eon to do or what they want out of the franchise or what they want Ian Fleming publications to do or not do or whatever. But like the thing that we all like about it and that means so much to us, like has kind of got nothing to do with anything that anyone's done. Like it's what we've brought to it. And you know that couldn't have been planned, you know, couldn't have been like mapped out or anything like that. I don't think Cubby Broccoli or anyone else thought when like putting these things into the world, like, oh, this is gonna mean that like, you know, 9-year-old kids who like feel abandoned by all the male figures in their lives are going to like look up to this character, but not maybe in a simplistic way, but kind of like in a kind of complicated way and find all these things about it that, you know, mirror their own experience. Like no one thought that. You know, like if that hadn't happened, then I wouldn't have this kind of like set of feelings towards it,
yeah.
you know? And so I think like when I think about like the future of Bond and all this kind of stuff. Like I mean, of course, I kind of like have like my like preferences, but I get most nervous when it seems like people want a certain set of feelings to be chased,
Yeah.
you know? Because then I think, well, then you're really closing things down, actually. Then you're really kind of like narrowing things. And if I think about like things about Bonds that make me bristle the most, it's been the times when actually some of those projections about the character have been kind of taken too seriously, you know, and the ambiguities have been kind of like closed down. So yeah, there's a thought.
Such as,
Oh, I'm gonna disagree. But like my big one is the whole 2012 stuff.
mm,
It's the whole Bond at the Olympics. It's
hmm
Bond at the Olympics. That's what it is.
mm.
I I think Bond should not be at the Olympics. It should not have been doing the thing with the Queen. It's just like that. It goes through me. It goes through me. It's a representation of such a narrow conception of Bond and
Mhm.
such an establishment one that that really like bristles on me, especially because I think like in the British sort of recent memory, like you see this so much with the sort of the so-called centrist dads, but like 2012 is like the pinnacle of like, modern British,
Mm.
achievement and stuff or this moment. But like it's kind of like a false memory. And I think that in
Did it?
this kind of like in this 2012 exists as this kind of like this is like really wanky, but like this kind of like hyperreal simulacrum of Britain. You know, it's this kind of like this version of Britain that we can kind of see like in this media, but like it wasn't actually reflecting what was going on at the time. And I say that partly because of like actual politics that I was involved in at the time. So to build the Olympic stadium and all the grounds and everything like that, loads and loads of working class people, particularly working class women who were mothers, got evicted from their houses in order to make way for both the park, but also for like the media center. So there was a campaign at the time that I was like covering very closely as a journalist and as an activist called the Focus E15 Moms. And it was all these moms who'd been displaced from their houses with their children directly because of the Olympics. Because there was, as happens with, I love the Olympics as a spectacle, I completely do. But like there is unfortunately this persistent pattern where where the Olympics goes, there is like a social cleansing that happens around it. Whether it's like moving all the homeless people out of the
Mm.
area or
Mm.
whatever. But like in this case, it was moving people out of their homes and out of London, away from their safety nets and stuff. And there's been a lot of research about this done since. So that's in the borough of Newham, and they were promised housing in Newham, and then they were told that they weren't going to be relocated in Newham, they were going to be relocated in a different borough, and then not in London at all, and so on. And so like it was actually like a really dark time.
Mm.
And it was like 2 years into like the austerity project when like the social safety net was completely being cut left, right, and center. And so this idea that kind of because of this big mediatized spectacle, it was actually like a high point for Britain rather than a Britain that was actually, kind of like if you imagine like the scene after the end of the Italian job, like, and actually the bus is going to teeter and then it's not coming back, like that's where we really kind of were.
Well, I wasn't aware of
And
that. I wasn't aware of those exact circumstances you just outlined there. I've got to say, I'm not surprised because let's be honest, you're not going to move a load of rich people out of their houses, are you? So that's what's always going to happen, sadly. But the a lot of people have very selective memories about the Olympics.
mm,
Like you, I enjoyed it as a spectacle. My husband is an Olympics addict. We have to watch the opening ceremony at least annually, because it recreates that feeling. But I'm
mm,
always at pains to point out, he really loves it when I do this, that of all the controversies that led up to that, and everyone thought that it was going to be a massive flop. And Danny Boyle and co pulled off a artistic triumph on the night. but it was not a certain deal at all. And there
Hmm.
was so much controversy in the run up to it. But we seem to have moved past all of that. And obviously, James Bond is a key part of that opening ceremony. And you said about you don't feel like James Bond, him being very establishment in
Mm.
that clip. I wrote quite a lot about Bond being both establishment and anti-establishment. I think when I tackled the queer review of Thunderball, because I agree that I personally don't think Bond should ever be an establishment figure. Um, he sometimes is roped in with that, and particularly when I wrote about The Spy Who Loved Me. But people forget that, at the start of The Spy Who Loved Me, and in fact, it appeared on a documentary the other day, that clip, and it was sort of being used to kind of represent how much of a figurehead of Britain Bond was. But I was just like, that part where he goes, but James, I need you. So does England. And there's the parodic trumpet note on the soundtrack. It's supposed to be satirizing jingoism in that scene rather than
Yeah.
actually celebrating it. But people use the whole idea of keeping the British end up as a way of celebrating Britain, which I know is sort of what Fleming was doing in the books and trying to give Britain its ego back after it had been bashed out of it after the Second World War, the Suez Crisis, and everything else. But James Bond is establishment figure. You simply can't find it in Fleming, I don't think, and I think it's a misreading of the films.
I think this is it. It's just that and to go back to my original point, I mean, like, it's not that I don't think that like, um, that reading of Bond isn't like legitimate or like doesn't exist or whatever. Like, if that's what Bond is to you, like a symbol of like national identity and all the good things about Britain, like, I am happy for you. But like, it's specifically about like the way that mediatizing Bond in a particular way like closes down the room for interpretation.
Mm,
And I think that's what like sits uncomfortably with me. So
mm,
like, and I sort of use the Olympics only because I was very close to like what the other side of the Olympics was. And I'm also like, when the Olympics is on, I want to watch it all day, every day and whatever. Even though, we can probably all agree that like, if a Bond villain was going to enter into any sport, it'd be like the modern pentathlon or whatever, you know, but but like, I mean, where I was at university at the time, um, a whole big section of the campus, because it's kind of close to London, like was just being given over to the Olympics. The main road was like cut into two, and one of them was made like an Olympic lane that also, if you were rich, you could buy a pass to drive in. And so, like, everyone else had to sit in traffic. While if you were anything to do with the Olympics, or if you had spent, 500 quid on a pass, you could drive traffic free and all of this kind of business. Like it was this really weird
mm,
time of kind of like social reorganization that when it's like, on your TV, it seems very different. It's like when it's like on your doorstep. And yeah, we sometimes hear about when it's in Beijing or when it's in Rio or something like that. We,
mm,
hear some of the stories, but like to see it kind of firsthand happening here, it seemed like the opposite of like British exceptionalism, you know? And
mm,
so then to see sort of like Bond like tied into it in this way, yeah, kind of like stuck in the throat a little bit because it seemed like, pinning Bond down in a really specific way, you know. And actually, I tell you what it did, like to bring it back to like to actual like, canon Bond, it like if people take that scene like where Bond is like stood looking over Whitehall in Skyfall and he sees the flag and everything like that. If you take that in the context of the film, it can mean so much. It's so rich. It means so many different things. Some people probably look at it and think like, you know, like this is, thinking about like, M and thinking about like the establishment and thinking about Britain and all this kind of stuff. But then other people, you know, look at it and think like about the whole M Silver saga and actually this kind of like normalization of kind of like burning your agents and stuff, and this fact that this kind of just happens in this world, and actually it's awfully like cutthroat, and everyone is kind of indispensable, really, and we're going to move on from M just in the same way as M moved on from Bond when she thought he was dead at the beginning of the film, you know, and like all of this kind of stuff. And so like it can mean so many different things, and that's what makes it like so rich and like, it's why I love it. I love it. But
It's
like,
like I actually hate the ending of Skyfall so much. Yeah,
yeah,
I
yeah.
know.
I mean, I don't like it. It's not my favorite, but it's this is it speaks to why I can read it in such a way as why it speaks to like why I like Bond in general.
Mm,
But then what I feel like Bond at the Olympics does is it kind of like it takes something like that and it says no,
yes,
it's
yeah, I see
this,
what you
no, it's
mean. Yeah,
this.
it pins it down too much. So
Yeah.
yeah, I hate the ending of Skyfall for similar reasons to where you've outlined, really. And I know Sam Mendes himself has said
Mm,
a couple of years later he really regretted a lot of the Union Jack iconography and a lot of the nationalistic symbolism of that film as well, partly because of what our government did in subsequent years. But I think the power of it, and as much as I am, I've said many times I'm not a huge fan of the film Skyfall because I think it represents something of a regressive step after the kind of progressive marches forward of Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace. But
I agree.
it's a dialogue with the audience, isn't it? And
Yeah.
some people absolutely adore Skyfall. My husband adores Skyfall, for all the reasons that I don't like Skyfall.
Mm.
And you're absolutely right. That's what you said was really stuck with me about they never intended a 9-year-old going through what you went through to have those really deep feelings develop about Bond. And I have really deep feelings about Skyfall, negative feelings about Skyfall,
Mm.
but I've got those strong feelings about Skyfall, and I think that's what makes Bond so powerful because we develop those feelings.
Yeah, enormously. I mean, your queer review of Skyfall is one that like, I share with people like all the time.
Mm.
It's like such a great piece of writing. And not enough people say that to you on this podcast, so I'm telling you.
Oh, thank you, Paul.
Um, but it's like, yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, I have a real like hot and cold sort of response to that film, because I mean, one of the things I really loved about it as I was watching it the first time was like the iconoclasm of like
Mm.
the DB5 getting absolutely, torn to shreds. And I was like, wow, they really went there. Like it really like that. I was impressed. And then, when it's kind of like, oh, we're putting it back together. It's like, oh, for God's sake, like it's just, yeah, I just didn't seem to have the little courage of its convictions quite, Um, and I don't know, maybe a little bit of personal preference, but yeah, to reiterate, like it's just the closing down of that ambiguity
Yeah,
that I think doesn't work.
yeah.
And I think, look, if to go back to the sort of outsider theme, like if Bond doesn't feel like he fits in Blades,
Mm.
definitely doesn't feel like he fits in Buckingham Palace. I'm
No.
sorry, he doesn't. Like he 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 may well end up being there and find himself there, but he will have a lot of different feelings about it
Yeah, yeah.
whilst he's there. Um, You'd probably be judging the quality of the eggs or something. Uh, but
The amount
like,
of times he turns down, I know eventually in Casino Royale 67, he does accept
yes, great
knighthood.
point.
He
Yeah,
does eventually, but he's very reluctant to accept any kind of honor in the Fleming books. At this
yes,
point,
great point.
I'll just say I felt similarly conflicted about picking up an MBE from Buckingham Palace, maybe for about 2 seconds. Um, Maybe not quite as conflicted as Bond there, but yeah, I think I would always argue for Bond being outsider, but also insider, and establishment and non-establishment. And I think that's it, isn't it? if we try to pin down Bond with any kind of label, he really resists those binary opposites. If you try to pin Bond down either side of a binary opposition, I think you're on a high road to nowhere.
I think if I had to sum him up in a word, and a thing that has always drawn me to the character, and obviously in the context of this conversation, thinking about whether it's the type of work I've sought out or the things that I've kind of wanted for myself, like because it's not like I've you know like I've wanted to kind of like do things in life and like make it have achievements and all of that kind of stuff. I don't want to like make myself an outsider in this kind of minoritarian kind of way,
Mm,
or kind of like sort of like martyrdom, sort of whatever. It's more of a
mm,
struggle, really, of
mm,
a sort of like
mm,
feeling like I kind of want to, do things, but just not feeling like it's kind of clicking or whatever, and feeling like on the outside of the group and that kind of
mm,
situation. But with Bond, like he's irreverent, and I think that his
mm,
irreverence is like that doesn't mean that he's not doesn't have the job that he has
mm,
or work for the government that he works for, or that he doesn't, X, Y, and Z. But like has his own relationship to it. Um and he doesn't just kind of like, kowtow to like
yes.
the authorities that be, or the interpretations that the projections that other people have for him or on him or whatever. Like no one kind of wants to put him in his box more than M through like the Bernard Lee years.
Hmm.
And like Bond doesn't want it. He won't
Yeah.
have it. The very, first scene that we see of Bond, like at work, he's like, palming like his Beretta, because he's like, yeah, all right, thanks very much. Having none of that. I'm gonna, do it my way, this kind of thing. And
Hmm.
I think that like when it like, Bond to me is like a fundamentally like irreverent
Hmm.
character because in irreverence there's like an ambivalence, right? There's a kind of ambivalence and also kind of holding back for something for oneself to think, I'm going to decide how I feel about it. Like,
Hmm.
whatever I'm kind of being told. There's a certain autonomy to it in the true sense of the word,
Hmm.
autonomy, auto being self, and nomi coming from nomos, which is like making of laws. He's like making his own
Ah.
law as he kind of goes along, or his own like kind of like his own logic. Um, And I think that's what's sort of like most appealing. So yeah, to draw a line under it, maybe that, seeing Bond being all like, oh, are you ready, mom? Whatever, just feels a little bit tugging the forelock in a way that doesn't, to me, really represent what it is about the character that I find so magnetic.
Hmm. Hmm.